A ladder rises against old red brick. Two ropes swing a fresh sign into place above a faded green awning. Cream letters on deep blue, a name that does not belong there. Down the street, a truck door slams hard enough to rattle glass across 4 lanes. A man in a work coat is already walking. Fast, jaw set. He does not wait for the light. He does not look at the traffic. Behind him, a delivery van swerves and honks. He does not turn his head. On the sidewalk, a young woman stands very still, one hand shielding her eyes against the morning sun, the other flat against her thigh. She has slept 3 hours in 7 weeks. She has just buried the only person who ever called her by her middle name. She has 40 seconds before he reaches her. The installer above her freezes on the ladder, waits, and the whole block, from the laundromat window to the shoe shop door, turns to watch. The new sign was halfway up the brick when Corwin Danvers stepped out of his truck and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the window of the laundromat across the street. He shouted first. Then he walked. Millie Danvers stood on the sidewalk with one hand shielding her eyes against the morning sun. The sign hung from 2 ropes above the old green awning, rocking gently while the installer guided it toward the brackets. Cream letters on a deep blue background. Millie's Market. 21 years old, and her name was going up on a building that had carried her grandfather's name for 51 years. Corwin left the truck door hanging open in the middle of the street. A delivery van behind him had to swerve. The driver honked. He didn't turn. "Take it down." The installer glanced at Millie. He was in his 60s, gray beard trimmed close, wearing a canvas jacket with the sleeves pushed up. He held one of the ropes with a hand that had guided a lot of family arguments up onto a lot of walls. Millie kept her eyes on the sign. "Keep going." Corwin stopped beside her. For 7 weeks he had spoken to her the way you speak to somebody who might break. Soft, careful, half a step back. Now his face had color in it, and his jaw was set forward, and he wasn't careful anymore. "You bought the building. You didn't buy the right to erase Grandpa." People had begun to watch from the laundromat window. 2 women pretending to fold sheets. One man leaning on a dryer. Millie could feel them without turning her head. The whole block had eyes today. "I'm not erasing him." Then why isn't his name on that sign? "Because it's my name too." The sign rose another foot. The installer glanced down and asked if the height looked right. She said it was fine. Corwin's hands went into his pockets and then came out again and then went back in. He did that when he didn't know where to put himself. He looked at her the way he had looked at her when she was 9 and had climbed onto the counter to reach the cough drops. Like she was doing something she was going to regret. Like he was the only adult in the room. Except she wasn't 9 anymore. And the counter she was climbing onto now was a whole building. "Millie, don't. Why are you doing this to us?" Us. That word. That was the word that had done all the damage over the last 7 weeks. Us. We. The family. As if the family had voted and she was the one holdout ruining the meeting. She lowered her hand from her eyes and turned to him. "To us." "Yes." "Corwin, I opened a store. You put yourself over Grandpa's name." "I put myself over your name." The installer coughed. The kind of cough people do when they've stopped pretending not to listen. Corwin's mouth closed. The sign settled against the brackets with a small metal knock, and the installer called down that he was locking it in. Millie's Market. Deep blue against old red brick. Her name in the morning sun. Above the awning her grandfather had painted himself the summer she turned 6. She should have felt triumph. She felt sick. She felt 7 weeks old and 800 years old at the same time. 7 weeks earlier, Corwin had been carving the funeral ham. He stood at the kitchen counter in her grandfather's apartment above the store, sawing through the spiral slices with the focus of a man defusing a bomb. He had brought his own knife from home because Ellis Danvers's knives were, in his opinion, unfit for meat. Corwin believed every job had one correct tool and one correct way to hold that tool. He had believed this since he was 12. Ellis had once told him, in front of the whole family, that a man who couldn't improvise wasn't a man. He was a manual. Corwin had never forgiven him and had also never stopped trying to prove him wrong with better tools. The apartment smelled of coffee and ham glaze and the lilies Deirdre had ordered from a florist 2 states away. The lilies were enormous, waxy, Too formal for the old kitchen, more suitable for the funeral of a senator than of an 81-year-old grocer who had spent his last 5 years complaining that store-bought tomatoes tasted like packing peanuts. Millie had slept 3 hours. She had worn a black dress that belonged to a neighbor because the only black dress she owned had been Mom's. And she wasn't wearing that today. Not to bury the last person who had ever called her by her middle name. The zipper of the borrowed dress pressed a hard line between her shoulder blades. She had come upstairs after the burial, set out plates, found the mustard, brewed 2 pots of coffee, cleared Grandpa's pill organizer off the windowsill before anyone could see the Tuesday compartment. Still full. Ellis had died on a Tuesday. I had complained about the oatmeal at 7:15, taken half his pills at 7:30, asked her whether she had locked the market's back door the night before. She had said yes. He had grunted. That grunt had been the last full sentence he ever spoke to her. At 8:20, she came up the stairs with fresh coffee in his blue mug and found him in his chair with one hand resting on the blanket she had tucked over his knees. The mug was still in her hand when she called 911. She had held it the whole time the paramedics were there. Somebody, later, gently took it from her fingers. She still didn't know who. Now Corwin was carving ham, and Deirdre was arranging plates, and Millie was standing at the sink, watching the water run over her hands without turning it off. Deirdre came through with a stack of paper plates against her chest. 54 years old, silver blonde hair that always looked freshly brushed even in rain. She had flown up from Charleston the day before the funeral and had been touching Millie every time she passed. Arm, shoulder, back of the hand. Small brushes of contact meant as comfort. After 4 years of lifting Grandpa and washing Grandpa and steadying Grandpa, Millie's skin was tired of being touched with purpose. There you are, sweet pea. I live here. I know you do. I've been trying to get you alone. Just for a second. Millie turned the faucet off. Deirdre, not now. I'm not cornering you. You're using your soft voice. Deirdre denied she had a soft voice. Millie reminded her of Aunt Louise's cat. That cat was 18. Millie almost laughed. The sound rose in her chest and got caught behind her ribs and stayed there. Deirdre saw the almost laugh and brightened as if she had accomplished something enormous. From the living room came the low murmur of relatives and old customers who had climbed the stairs to say goodbye. Somebody had turned on the ceiling fan. Every few rotations it clicked. Grandpa had complained about that click for 6 years. Millie had offered to replace the fan twice. Both times he had said there was nothing wrong with it except the click. Corwin laid slices of ham on a platter. We ought to go over a few things while we're all together. Deirdre said it softly to no one. There it is. Millie picked up the mustard jar and wiped a yellow smear from its rim with her thumb. What things? Building, mostly. Utilities. Insurance. Clean out. He spoke without looking at her, which made the whole list feel older than the funeral, like he had been carrying it around in his back pocket for a while. She set down the mustard. Utilities are paid through the month. Insurance renews in October. He clarified he did not mean what was due. He meant shutting everything down. The knife kept moving. Slice. Scrape. Slice. Deirdre set the plates on the table like she was setting them down on a witness stand. She murmured that nobody was asking Millie to handle all this alone. I have been handling it alone. Well, yes, but now you don't have to. Millie looked towards the hallway. Grandpa's bedroom door was closed. She had closed it herself before the luncheon because the bed was unmade and his slippers were still angled beneath the chair the way they were angled every morning. Like his feet had just left them. Like he was going to be right back. Corwin had tried the knob earlier. She had said not today. Sharp. Sharp enough that he had let go. Why would we shut down the utilities? Corwin finally looked up. Because the building's going on the market. Something inside Millie went very still. Not shock. Shock requires surprise. She had known the building would have to be discussed. She just hadn't known the discussion had already happened without her. When did we decide that? He rested both hands on the counter and called it the sensible thing. That isn't what I asked. He glanced at Deirdre. Deirdre folded a napkin in half and then in half again and then a third time, until it wasn't really a napkin anymore. Just a small white square she could hide behind. She admitted, with reluctance, that there had been a little talk. Last night, at the hotel, just generally. About selling my home. Corwin winced immediately and tried to walk it back. It wasn't her home. Legally, it was all three of theirs now. Three. Not because Millie's grandfather had left her a share directly, because her mother had. Grace Danvers had died 4 years ago at 41. Ovarian cancer. Diagnosed too late. Done in 7 months. She had left everything she had to Millie, which meant that when Ellis died, Grace's inherited share of the family building passed down to her only child. Millie was 21 years old, and she owned a third of a brick building on a street the developers hadn't figured out yet. Corwin owned a third, Deirdre owned a third, and Corwin was already talking about selling. She set the mustard down again, even though she hadn't picked it back up. Thank you for clarifying that. He tried to soften it. She cut him off. Don't Millie me. You just told me my house isn't mine. That is not what I said. It's what came out. Deirdre stepped between them without physically moving. Her whole face rearranged itself into something soft and pleading. She said, one more time, that Millie was exhausted and today was not the day. I'm right here. No, sweetheart. Then don't talk about me like I'm a room you're leaving. For a second, the kitchen sounded very loud. The faucet dripped. The fan clicked. Someone laughed near the window, unaware that a bacon carving and a burial and a real estate discussion had somehow braided into the same afternoon. Corwin sighed the sigh he had been sighing since he was 14 years old, and Grace was 7, and Millie's grandfather was still 6'2" and terrifying. They were trying to make this easier. He told her, for who? His eyes moved away first. Deirdre opened her purse. Millie watched her do it. Watched her reach in and pull out a pale green folder with the reluctance of a woman producing evidence in a trial she wished had never come to court. She had picked up a little information, was all she said. Millie did not touch the folder. On the cover, a silver-haired couple stood on a balcony holding coffee mugs. Their teeth were very white. Behind them, sunlight fell on a lawn no resident had ever been permitted to walk across. Not a retirement brochure, something more strategic. An LPN training program, 2 years, housing included, small stipend. Enrollment closes in 3 weeks. 2 states away. Deirdre spoke quickly and warmly, the way she spoke when she was afraid a sentence would collapse under its own weight. There was a spot for the fall cohort. She had called. If the application went in by the 12th, Millie was basically in. The housing was nice, really. Not a dorm, a studio, her own kitchen. Millie looked at her aunt. Deirdre's face was open and worried and completely certain that she was rescuing something. That was the worst of it. There was no cruelty here, no smirk, no calculating gleam. Deirdre had gathered brochures because she loved Millie. She had also chosen Millie's city, Millie's rooms, Millie's career, and the probable shape of the next 2 years of Millie's life without once asking whether Millie wanted to be a nurse. Millie had never mentioned wanting to be a nurse. Millie had, twice in the last year, mentioned that she wanted to think about the market. Deirdre had heard neither thing. I'm 21. I know how old you are. Do you? Corwin wiped the knife with a paper towel. Nobody was calling her a baby, he pointed out. Nursing school is saying it pretty clearly. He tried again. She could do worse than a paycheck and an apartment 2 hours from Deirdre. I could also do worse than sit in this kitchen without being handed a folder before the ham is cold. Deirdre flinched. Corwin almost laughed. Almost. Not quite. He warned her she had no plan. I have a week. He told her a week was not a plan. A week is longer than the 90 seconds you gave me before you told me to move to South Carolina. That landed. Deirdre pressed her lips together. Corwin turned back to the ham. The truth is, there's nothing keeping you here anymore. He said it kindly. He always said the worst things kindly. Nothing keeping you here. 4 years of adjusting Grandpa's pillow at 3 in the morning. The pharmacist who set aside his cough drops. Mrs. Prewitt 3 blocks over whose grocery bag Millie carried up her stoop every Thursday. The blue chair by the kitchen window where Grandpa used to sit and yell at the TV weatherman. The pantry door with pencil marks where Grace and Corwin and Deirdre had been measured as children. Grace's mark stopped at 15. That was the last summer she had lived at home before college. And downstairs, behind a locked door, the old market. People still knocked on that door. Even after Grandpa's hand-painted closed sign had faded almost white, even after the coolers went dark, people knocked. Mrs. Prewitt wanted eggs when the sidewalks froze. Owen Ostrom from the shoe shop wanted bread and exact change. A woman named Val from the laundromat wanted coffee filters at 7 in the morning because the gas station down the block sold ones that were somehow always the wrong size. Millie kept a folding table just inside the entrance, a cash box, 2 baskets, eggs, bread, whatever she could handle without pretending the store was open. Corwin knew about the table. He called it Millie's little charity project. "I need some air." Deirdre reached for her. Millie stepped aside before the hand landed. She crossed the living room, accepted 3 murmured condolences without stopping, and made her way down the narrow staircase to the market. The room met her with cool dust in the mineral smell of old brick. Afternoon light pressed through the papered-over windows. Empty shelves ran in shadowed rows. Grandpa's wooden counter stood at the front, scarred by 50 years of coins and crates and elbows and one-drop cleaver nobody had ever confessed to. Beside the counter was Millie's folding table. 6 cartons of eggs, 4 loaves of bread, peach preserves, a coffee can with $14.85 inside it. Someone had pushed an envelope under the door. On the front, in shaky blue ink, were the words, "For last Thursday." Inside, $9 and a folded note. "Thank you, Millie. Would have had crackers for supper again." She read it twice. Above her, footsteps crossed the apartment. Her family was portioning the future, wrapping leftovers, deciding what could be thrown away, deciding what could be shipped south. She went behind Grandpa's counter and ran her palm across the worn wood. She could still see the market the way it had been the summer she was 11. The humming coolers, the handwritten prices, Ellis shouting a question about tomato paste from the storeroom and trusting her answer without ever quite admitting he needed it. Corwin came down 10 minutes later. He stood at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't turn on the front lights. He knew where the switch was. He didn't reach for it. He wanted to call an agent Monday. Millie folded the note and put it in her pocket. No. No what? No agent, not Monday. Then when? "I don't know yet." He told her that was not how this worked. "Then why did you ask when?" His jaw tightened. That same jaw Grandpa had, set forward, muscle jumping just below the ear. She kept going. He had had 4 months to think about this building. He denied it. "Yes, you have. Cal Hendren told me you asked him what the wholesale account was worth in April." Silence. Corwin's face did something complicated. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to being caught with a hand on a doorknob you had told everyone you weren't going to touch. That was not what she thought it was. He told her, "Then explain it to me." He said not tonight. She let him have that, not because he deserved it, because if she pushed 1 more inch tonight, she would push all the way to something she couldn't take back, and she didn't have the energy to lose a family member 3 hours after burying one. He climbed the stairs. Heavy. She listened to the 3rd step creak the way it always creaked. She stayed behind the counter until her legs ached. The bell above the door had been disconnected for 18 years. She could still hear it in her head. Somebody knocked on the market door 2 mornings later at 7:40. Millie was in the kitchen upstairs, blue mug in her hand, coffee too weak, cardigan buttoned wrong. Her body knew the hour before her mind did. Second pill. Complain about morning TV, soft scrape of the chair, except there was no chair to scrape now. The knock came again. She went down. Mrs. Hollis Prewitt stood beyond the market door in a purple raincoat, white hair wrapped in a clear plastic scarf. 78 years old and possessed of the posture of a woman who had spent most of the 20th century being disappointed by service. "Bread. Good morning to you too." Hollis reported that the sidewalks were wet and the bakery was a mile. Bread. Wheat or white. Whichever isn't sliced too thin. Ellis always sliced it too thin toward the end. I was 90% hands by then. He could barely hold the knife. Then he should have let you slice it. Millie almost smiled. She hadn't smiled since Tuesday. It felt like reaching for a muscle that had gone to sleep. She pulled a loaf of white from the folding table and put it in a paper bag with a carton of eggs Hollis hadn't asked for. Hollis paid $5.30 exact and looked toward the darker part of the store. "You gonna keep doing this?" I don't know. Don't hem and haw at me, girl. Are you going to keep doing it or not? I don't know yet. Miss Prewitt. The old woman looked at her over the top of her glasses. Your grandpa put good eggs aside for me for 40 years. Never asked why. He just knew my hands shake. He never said a word about it either. Not one. That was Ellis. Millie's throat closed. Hollis lifted her bag against her chest and told her to think about it. But think fast. Sidewalks weren't getting any drier. She left. Millie stood in the doorway of the market and watched her cross the street toward the bus stop. Purple raincoat, 2 grocery items, 1 shaky hand, and Grandpa, silent about it for 40 years. She went back inside and stood in the middle of the empty floor and cried once. Hard, but for maybe 90 seconds. Then she wiped her face on her cardigan sleeve and got to work. The tall wooden cabinet was in the back storeroom. She had never opened it. Grandpa had never told her not to. He simply had never opened it in front of her, and Ellis Danvers had a way of communicating "do not touch that thing" without ever using words. The lock had rusted through years ago. She lifted the latch with her thumb. The cabinet was full, not with valuables, with notebooks, composition books, spiral-bound ledgers, small pocket-sized diaries, stacked, some so old that the covers were held together with masking tape. The top notebook had a date on the front in his handwriting, 1982. She sat on the floor of the storeroom in a pool of yellow light from the single bulb and opened it. It was not a business ledger. It was a list of names. Marlon Hobbs, 290, April, repaid August. Rita Vega, formula and diapers, $6, never repaid, do not remind. Cassius Malloy, 618 for a roast. He'll pay when the union check clears. Underneath the third entry, in different ink, a note added later. He didn't. Don't tell him I remember. Millie turned the page. Another list. Another year. Another dozen names. Some repaid. Most not. Almost none of them marked as debts owed. All of them written in her grandfather's careful block letters. The way he wrote when he wanted a thing to stay written down forever. Behind the notebooks, tied in a bundle with twine, were the letters. Some on lined paper. Some on the backs of envelopes. Some written in pencil so faded she had to hold them up to the light. Thank you, Mr. Danvers, for the milk this week. My husband got ours again on Monday. Thank you for not saying anything to Frank about the sausage. Ellis, you saved my mother's Thanksgiving twice. She never told anyone. Neither did I. But I want you to know that I know. Millie read for over an hour. She sat on the storeroom floor with her back against the cabinet and read through 1982 and 1983 and part of 84. 40 years of a man who had never once hugged her without being prompted. 40 years of a man who had told her, when she moved in at 17 with a suitcase and a bag of her mother's sweaters, that the third stair creaked and she should learn to skip it. 40 years of quiet, 40 years of eggs set aside for shaky hands. She closed the last book on her knees and did not cry this time. She just sat. Because it changed what the building was. The building wasn't a piece of real estate. The building was a promise that had been kept in secret for 4 decades by a man who was now buried in the ground and who had, apparently, been trying to hand her something on a Tuesday morning while he was asking about a locked back door. She looked down at her hands. She looked at the notebooks. She stood up. She had to find out something. 2 hours later, Millie was in the marble hallway of the town hall, blazer thrown on over jeans. No appointment. No reason to be there except that the tax assessor's office was open on Thursdays until noon, and she wanted to see the plat map for her building. Just to see it. Just to look. She was on her way down the corridor when she stopped. Corwin's voice, coming from behind the glass door of the planning department. She stepped sideways into the shadow of a pillar. The planning office door was propped half open with a rubber wedge. Corwin was inside with a man she didn't recognize. Suit, tan folder, tube of rolled plans under one arm. If they could get the whole corner assembled, the stranger was saying, they were looking at maybe first quarter next year for demo. Corwin made a low noise of agreement. The two on the east side were locked in. The man went on. The barber had said yes last week. Odessa across the street had a lease clause they could work around. And the market, Corwin's voice. That's family. That's mine to handle. The man in the suit made a small approving sound and told him to move on it soon. The commission wanted a decision by Q3 or they went to Plan B. Corwin promised he would have it. Millie stopped breathing. Not one building, the whole corner. The barber, the laundromat lease, the shoe shop, Owen, Val, Cassius, who lived above the barber, all of them. The whole block Grandpa had kept in eggs and bread and quiet forgiveness for 40 years, being quietly sold out from under everyone, one handshake at a time, by her uncle. Who was inside that door right now, calling her family and her building and her home 3 items in a spreadsheet? She backed up against the pillar and pressed her hand to her mouth. Then she walked out. She walked all the way back to the market. 6 blocks. Didn't remember any of them. Didn't remember the crossing signals or the buses or the woman who bumped her elbow at the corner of Maple and asked if she was all right. She unlocked the market door with a hand that wasn't quite steady. She went behind the counter. She opened the drawer where Grandpa had kept the good pen. She pulled out a piece of paper. She wrote, at the top, in her mother's slanted handwriting, because it was the handwriting Millie had inherited whether she wanted it or not. What I have, what I need, what it costs. She stared at the page for a long time. Then she wrote a 4th line, underneath, mine. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table upstairs with her phone in her hand and a mug of tea gone cold in front of her. She had called Lorna Akins, the property agent who had managed the small clapboard house Grace had left her in the next town over. The house Grace had bought with the first paycheck of a job she got right out of college. The house Grace had lived in with Millie until she got sick. The house Millie had rented out for the last 4 years because it was too full of her mother to sleep in. Lorna picked up on the second ring. I know it's late. You never call me late. I want to sell the house. Silence. Long enough that Millie thought the line had dropped. Lorna asked her to say it again. I want to sell it. Honey, don't honey me. Lorna said her name like the word cost something. Honey. That was her mother's house. I know whose house it is. Lorna. I have known whose house it is every single day for 4 years. Lorna was not saying she couldn't. Lorna was saying be sure. I'm sure. Are you? Millie looked at the ceiling, at the old water stain shaped like a bird, at the crack in the plaster near the fan Grandpa had never let her fix. Maricella's lease ran through August. She reminded Lorna. Lorna said that was fine. She could list it with the lease attached. It would narrow the buyer pool, but the yard was nice enough that a landlord would bite. How much? Lorna gave a number. Not enough. Not enough to buy Corwin and Deirdre out, do the repairs, get inventory, and survive a first year. Not close. Millie thought about Corwin's voice through the planning office door. That's family. That's mine to handle. She told Lorna to list it. Tomorrow. As is. She was not going to argue about the furnace. Lorna tried her name. She used Lorna's back at her. A pause. Lorna asked if she was eating. Sometimes. If she was sleeping. Sometimes. If she was doing this because she was grieving. Millie closed her eyes. I'm doing this because if I don't, my uncle is going to hand this street over to a man with a tube of plans, and I am going to spend the rest of my life knowing I let him. Another pause. Longer. All right. Honey. Lorna would draw it up. Don't honey me. Lorna reminded her that she had known Millie since Millie was 7. Honey. She would honey her if she wanted. Millie let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. It was the closest thing she had produced in 5 days. It counted. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table until the tea was fully cold and the light outside had gone blue and the street lamp on the corner had come on with its usual half-second buzz. She thought about her mother, Grace, who had bought a small yellow house with the first real check of her life. Grace, who had painted the front door red without asking the HOA. Grace, who had told Millie, on the last good day, that a woman without a room of her own eventually becomes a room in somebody else's house. Millie was 21 years old. She had just decided to trade a room for a room. The next afternoon, she signed the listing papers at Lorna's kitchen table. Maricela, the tenant, was there, retired dental hygienist, 60-something, had painted the front door a slightly deeper red and never told Millie. She stood in the doorway of Lorna's dining room with her arms crossed and her chin high, ready to be evicted. Millie told her the lease was safe. Whoever bought it took her with it. Maricella's shoulders dropped half an inch. I'm sorry. I love this house. I know you did. Maricella's voice softened. You could still sell something you loved. It was just harder. Millie looked at her. That's free. I charge by the hour. Lorna laughed. Millie signed. Then she drove herself back to the market and parked crooked at the curb and sat in the car with both hands on the wheel and did not cry. Because she had cried on Tuesday and she had cried in the storeroom on Wednesday, and there was no time on Thursday to cry. There was only time to figure out what came next. She looked up through the windshield at the brick building she was now going to have to fight 3 grown-ups for. Above the papered-over front window, the ghost of Grandpa's old sign was still visible in the brick. A darker rectangle where the paint had shielded the wall from sun for half a century. She stared at that rectangle for a long time. Then she got out of the car, unlocked the market door, and stepped inside. Behind her, on the sidewalk in the last of the afternoon light, her long shadow stretched across the concrete. Grandpa had poured himself in 1971. Back when the whole neighborhood was young and no one had yet learned that a man with a tube of plans under his arm was a slower and more polite kind of storm. She locked the door behind her. She turned on one row of lights. She sat down at the counter, opened her legal pad to a fresh page, and started to write, because there were 7 weeks between right now and a sign going up over the awning, and she was going to need every one of them. The market at dawn had a sound of its own. The compressor of the old dead cooler ticked as the metal cooled overnight. The building settled against itself. Somewhere in the walls a pipe knocked twice, the way it had always knocked twice since Millie was 17 and lying in the guest room upstairs, listening to her grandfather move around downstairs at 5 in the morning. Except now the movement downstairs was hers. Cassius Malloy showed up on a Monday morning carrying a metal thermos and a tape measure that had definitely once belonged to Ellis. He had stolen it in '87. He confessed. He had been waiting for the right day to give it back. Millie looked at the tape measure, then at him. Cassius was 70 years old, broad in the shoulders in the way older men get broad, moved slow because his knees hated him. He wore a plaid shirt buttoned wrong at the collar, and he was looking at her the way people look when they're afraid you might tell them to leave. She pointed out he could have brought it back any Tuesday for the last 38 years. Wouldn't have been a confession then. Fair. She let him in. He walked the sales floor slowly, ran his palm over the wooden counter, stopped at the darker patch of pine near the register where Ellis used to lean his hip. He had stood right there till the end. Cassius said, talking about opening back up. He never did. But he talked. He never told me he was scared. He wouldn't have. Scared of what? Cassius took a long sip from the thermos. Scared of coming down here one morning and finding out nobody needed him anymore. He had asked Cassius once, just asked, whether people remembered the meat counter, then spent the next 20 minutes telling him he didn't care. Millie stayed very still, because that was the same voice she'd been living with for 4 years. The voice that asked whether Maricella's rent had come in on time and then said, in the next breath, that it didn't matter, that the house was hers to lose. The voice that had asked, the morning he died, whether she had locked the back door, not because he wanted her to check, because he wanted to know she was still here. She looked around the store with new eyes, every scratch in the wood, every crooked shelf, not a store, an answer he'd been afraid to hear. Where do you want to start? Cassius was already snapping the tape measure open. Shelves? They worked all morning. 2 shelves had rusted through at the base. Another leaned because Ellis had propped one leg on a flattened box of powdered donuts, and the cardboard had been holding it up since the Reagan administration. Millie laughed out loud when she saw it. Actually laughed. First real laugh in 7 weeks. Cassius didn't say anything about the laugh. He just kept measuring. That was a kindness she wouldn't understand until she was much older. The restaurant auction was in a banquet hall out by the highway. Folding chairs. Fluorescent light. The smell of coffee that had been on a burner too long. Millie went looking for a cooler and shelving she could afford, and instead she found 37 dining chairs, 2 chocolate fountains, a mechanical bowl that looked like it had been used as a weapon, and enough stainless steel pans to feed the entire state legislature. The cooler she wanted was near the loading doors. Three-door model, glass fronts, only 6 years old, according to the auction sheet. Millie opened it and breathed in the sharp chemical smell of fresh disinfectant. Don't! Millie turned. Short woman, close-cropped gray curls, gold hoop earrings big enough to notice. Canvas tote over one shoulder printed with the words, "Feed people, not egos." She was watching the cooler the way you watch a dog you don't trust. Don't smell it. Don't bid. Why? The woman crouched and pointed to the compressor housing. Fresh screws, scratches around the panel. Somebody had been in there this month. Millie suggested it might have been repaired. They did enough to make it cold till 4 p.m. The woman corrected. She stood up, held out her hand. Bernadine Wexford. Berna. Millie gave her own name back. Berna looked at her hard. Ellis Danvers's granddaughter. Wasn't she? Yes, ma'am. She had heard Millie was reopening. Cassius Malloy had been dragging shelves onto the sidewalk. Man could turn a nap into a press release. You knew Ellis. Everybody knew Ellis. She had bought sausage from him for 30 years. He never charged her for the string. Millie almost said something, then didn't. Because if she started listing everyone Ellis had never charged for something, she was going to have to sit down on the floor of a banquet hall in front of a woman she'd just met. Berna took her elbow. Not sharp, just a hand steering her. There was an ugly one down the row that actually worked. She said, the ugly one was solid. 2 doors. Small dent near the base. Millie bought it for $400 less than she'd budgeted. Berna won a lot of sheet pans and lost a commercial mixer to a man who bid on it like it was a moral test. Afterward, they drank burnt coffee out of foam cups while they waited for invoices. Berna wanted to know if she had food service experience. Grocery. A long time ago. Different animal, Berna said. I know. She asked if Millie planned to do prepared meals. Eventually. Berna rolled her eyes so hard Millie could actually hear it. Everybody said eventually, when they meant they hadn't priced labor. Millie unfolded the 4-page plan from her purse, handed it over. Berna read it standing up, ran her finger down the columns, snorted twice, corrected 2 numbers in ballpoint pen in the margin. The produce order was ambitious. Berna announced, Cassius helped with that. Of course he did. That man believed bacon was a vegetable. Millie laughed. Berna did not. Berna was already writing on the back of the page. Start with fewer varieties. Cabbage keeps. Carrots keep. Apples don't panic. Don't stock 6 kinds of lettuce so people can admire your ambition. She handed it back. Millie asked if she was charging for this. Yes. How much? Berna named an hourly rate low enough to be insulting. Millie looked at her. That was not enough. That's so, Berna murmured. Berna, that's not enough. The woman's mouth twitched. Pay her that for now. Buy her lunch. If the store opened, they would renegotiate. She looked toward the ugly cooler across the room. Millie didn't have a store yet. No. Well, Berna picked up her tote and told her to get one. The first delivery driver was named Ambrose Ostrom. I was 26 years old, lean, bearded, wore a dark green work jacket with the sleeves permanently pushed up past his elbows. He backed the truck toward the rear door and climbed out carrying a clipboard and a folded strap, and the general air of a man who was working 3 jobs and hadn't been surprised in a long time. He read Millie's order sheet, then read it again. She had bought too many canned beans. He informed her. They keep, so did bricks. Nobody ate enough of either to build a business. Millie looked at him. Berna picked the produce. Ah, you know her. Everybody knew her. Church kitchen. His Uncle Owen made him deliver there twice a month. She had once looked at a pallet of donated bread and said the words that is a felony out loud. Millie almost laughed. She did not, because Ambrose was standing very still by the dented cooler with his hands in his back pockets, looking at the way she had propped it against the wall. And his face had done something she recognized. She had done that face for 4 years, the face of a person trying not to notice something that was breaking. She asked him what? Her cord. What about it? She was going to trip and take the whole compressor with her when she did. I didn't wait to be asked. He set down his clipboard, went out to the truck, came back with a spool of black cable tie and a small flat pry tool. and rerouted the cord along the baseboard in 6 minutes. He didn't charge her for that either. When he left, he stopped at the door. Owen had said she might need help around here. She pointed out Owen could have asked her himself. He had asked. Ambrose said. He had just asked him. Then he was gone, and Millie was standing in an empty store with a straight cord and a cooler that hummed and no idea what to do with the small warm thing that had just moved in her chest, which she did not want to think about, which she pushed down and locked in the same drawer as everything else she was not thinking about, which included her mother's yellow front door, and a folder on Corwin's dashboard, and a man in a tan blazer at the town hall saying the whole corner. She drove to Corwin's house on a Wednesday afternoon. She had not planned to. She had been standing at the sink washing 3 jars of preserves, and the thought had come up whole, fully formed, in her grandmother's voice. Go now. Before you talk yourself out of it, ask him in his own kitchen where he has to feed you a glass of water. So she went. Corwin's house was a low ranch on a cul-de-sac out past the county line. Susan, his wife, opened the door before Millie could knock. Susan had been married to Corwin for 36 years without picking up his habit of managing every room she entered, which was one of the more remarkable things about her. Oh, honey, is he here? In the garage. Susan, I know. Susan stepped back to let her in. She had told him, she said quietly. 3 times he needed to just tell Millie the whole thing. He hadn't told Millie anything. That was what Susan meant. The garage was warm. Corwin was at the workbench under a lamp, sanding the edge of a piece of trim. He didn't look up when she came in. He knew her footsteps. He had known her footsteps since she was 2. She stood on the other side of the workbench, put her hands flat on it. I saw you at town hall. The sanding stopped. He didn't lift his head. Which day? Thursday. Silence. He set the sandpaper down, wiped his hands on his jeans, looked at her. How much had she heard? Enough. Susan stayed in the doorway. Didn't leave. Didn't come in. Millie loved her for that. Corwin, you're selling the whole corner. He was not selling anything yet. You are handshake close. Not the same thing. You told a man in a tan blazer that Grandpa's building was yours to handle. Grandpa was in the ground 4 weeks. Millie, do not Millie me. Corwin picked up a wood clamp. Put it back down. Picked it up again. He didn't know where to put his hands, and she watched him not know, and something in her chest went hard and hot at the same time. He had said it was his to handle because he was the man in the family. He denied it. You said it because you thought if Grandpa's building had to be pried out of somebody's hands, it wouldn't be mine, because I'm 21 and I'm the girl, and I'm the one everybody keeps flying folders at from South Carolina. That was not what he meant. That is what it is, though, whether you meant it or not. He stared at her, because she had never talked to him like this before. Because she had been 11, and she had been 14, and she had been 18, and she had been the niece. And now she was standing in his garage with her mother's cheekbones and her grandfather's eyes, and she was not the niece anymore. He set the clamp down for good. His company was going to close. Then say that. I'm saying it. Say the rest. He looked at her for a long time. He owed 6 figures to a supplier. He had 2 crews he couldn't pay past November. If he didn't close on this land deal by the end of the 3rd quarter, Susan would go back to work at 58 and they would sell the house. Susan, in the doorway, made a small sound. Not surprise. Confirmation. Millie realized, with a small sick jolt, that Susan had been waiting for him to say those words out loud to someone who wasn't her. He could have told her. He couldn't. You could have. He had been the man of this family since he was 19 years old, and his father told him he was the manual. He said. He didn't get to walk into a room and say he couldn't do it. Grandpa had said that. Yes, Grandpa had said that. She looked at him, because she suddenly understood something she had not understood at the funeral. Corwin was not a man selling his family out. Corwin was a boy who had been told at 19 that he wasn't a man, and had spent 41 years trying to prove it, and was now watching the last thing that could prove it slip out of his hands. That did not make it okay. That made it worse, because what she was about to tell him was going to feel to him like the same thing his father had done, and there was nothing she could do about that. I am not going to sell you the building. Millie, I am not going to sell it, not to you, not to a developer, not to anybody. Grandpa left 1/3 of it to my mother. My mother left it to me. I am going to buy your third and Deirdre's third, and I am going to open the store. With what? I sold Mom's house. He went white, actually white. All the color left his face in one long slide. He sat down on the stool at the workbench like his legs had quit. Susan came in. Millie kept her eyes on Corwin. She was not selling the corner. She was not going to help him make his quarter. She was sorry his company was in trouble. She was. But he had been selling her street before Grandpa was cold, and he had been doing it with his last name in his mouth. Corwin stared at the concrete floor. She had sold Grace's house. Yes. Millie. Yes. He put his head in his hands. She stood there and let him. Because he was allowed to grieve, too, the world he'd been building on top of her. After a long time, he lifted his head. Did she know what happened to him now? Yes. And she did it anyway. You did it first. Susan put her hand on Corwin's shoulder. Not to comfort him, to hold him in place, because he was the kind of man who might have stood up and said something he could never take back. And Susan was the kind of woman who had spent 36 years knowing when to press down on his shoulder. Millie walked out of the garage. She got in her car. She drove 3 miles before she pulled onto the shoulder and cried into the steering wheel for 4 full minutes. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve, drove home, unlocked the market, and made phone calls until midnight, because now there really wasn't any going back. Opening day was on a Wednesday. Millie unlocked the front door at 6:58 in the morning. Berna was already inside, tying her apron. Ambrose had come in at 5 and left again by 6:30 after leveling the cooler for the 3rd time and warning her that the compressor was going to be loud until it settled. Cassius was on the sidewalk pretending to read a newspaper, which was his way of making sure someone was watching the front door in case Millie fainted. She did not faint. Hollis Prewitt was waiting on the sidewalk in her purple raincoat. You're late. I'm 2 minutes early. I've been here since 6. Then you're just early. That's on you. Don't sass me, girl. Hollis walked in, basket, straight to the eggs, like the store had never closed. Millie flipped the sign to open and stood in the doorway for a second, one hand on the doorframe, watching the street. Owen Ostrom raised his coffee cup at her from the shoe shop across the way. Val from the laundromat came out drying her hands on a dish towel and shouted, "Well, look at you!" across 2 lanes of traffic. Rosalind Fenster from the laundromat next door leaned in the doorway of her own shop with her arms folded and gave Millie one long approving nod. Not one of them said anything sentimental. That was the kindest thing about them. The first day made $184 more than Millie had projected. The 5th day made $112 less. By the 2nd week, she understood something Berna had been trying to tell her. A customer was not the same thing as a rush. A rush was weather. A customer was a habit. She needed habits. Berna started making soup on Tuesdays and Fridays. Big pot. Whatever produce was closest to turning, cabbage, carrots, the onions Millie had bought too many of. She portioned it into pint containers with masking tape labels. Low sodium in blue, regular in green. She priced them at $6. They sold out by 3 p.m. the first day. They sold out by 1 on the 2nd. Ambrose showed up on a Thursday with an idea. Millie needed suppers. They had soup. Suppers were different, he said. Soup was what you bought when you were planning ahead. Suppers were what you bought when the day was over. Millie looked at him, because he was standing in her market at 4 in the afternoon, and he had used his hands to draw the difference in the air between soup and supper. And it was, without question, the most sincere gesture she had watched him make. She suggested he could cook them. He had a job. He could cook early, twice a week, small batch, test it. You had a restaurant. Ambrose went still, just for a second, like a door closing on a room he had decided to stop walking into. Yes, ma'am, he answered finally. He had had a restaurant. He had had a partner. They had disagreed about money, and now he did not have a restaurant. That was all he was going to say about it in a store he didn't own. Berna, at the register, snorted. He had said, "Ma'am," she muttered. He meant it. Fine. Millie thought about it for a full day. Then she said yes to a trial. 20 suppers, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, single portions, no group packs. They sold out in 90 minutes on a Friday afternoon. She watched the Last Supper go out the door in the hands of a widower from 2 blocks over, and she stood behind the register for a long minute with her hand pressed flat to the countertop, because this was going to work, which was terrifying in a whole different way than failure would have been. Then a Tuesday morning in October, a man in a windbreaker walked in with a clipboard. He was polite. That was the first thing Millie noticed. He said good morning. He said her name was Miss Danvers. Was that correct? He was wearing a lanyard with a small county seal on it. He was with the health inspector's office, he explained, and there had been a complaint. About what? Preparation and sale of prepared foods without the appropriate permit modification. Berna, at the produce table, went completely still. The inspector was kind about it. He looked at the soup labels. He looked at the containers. He asked to see the current permit, which was a retail grocery permit that Millie's grandfather had renewed every February for the last 5 decades, and which did not, technically, include hot prepared foods for takeout unless you filed a supplementary section. Which section? Section G, Small Kitchen Amendment. How long did that take? 2 to 4 weeks, sometimes 6. He wrote up a citation, told her the soup and the suppers had to stop. Immediately. Today, he wasn't shutting the store, just the prepared food, until the paperwork went through. At the door, he told her he was sorry. He said it in the tone of a man who had, in fact, walked in prepared to shut down someone's whole life and was relieved to find only half a life to shut down. Millie thanked him. She waited until his car pulled away from the curb. Then she sat down on the stool behind the register and put her face in her hands. Berna didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, anonymous. He said anonymous. Rosalind had seen her uncle's truck at town hall 3 times last week. Millie lifted her head. She didn't know it was him. No, Berna didn't. Then don't say it. Berna looked her over the top of her glasses. She hadn't, which was true, which was worse than her saying it, somehow. The next 2 weeks were bad. The suppers stopped. The soup stopped. The Friday rush stopped. The habits Berna had built with such patience over 4 weeks started to unbuild themselves, one small conversation at a time. Gloria came in on a Thursday and said sadly that she was going to have to pick up frozen from the supermarket for the weekend. The widower from 2 blocks over stopped coming in on Fridays. Val brought Millie an entire tin of homemade brownies on a Monday with no explanation and left before Millie could thank her, which meant Val knew exactly what was happening and did not have the heart to say it out loud. Berna's hours got cut. Millie tried not to cut them. She did the math 3 times looking for a way. There wasn't one. When she told Berna, Berna nodded once and said only that she would work Tuesday, save the Fridays for Ambrose. Ambrose, unable to cook, doubled his delivery routes. He said it was fine. He said fall was busy anyway. He didn't come in for coffee for 11 days. Millie started sleeping 4 hours a night. She started arriving at the store at 4:30 in the morning to face shelves. She started staying past 9 to redo the day's paperwork. She stopped eating lunch. She stopped calling Deirdre back. She stopped answering when Susan checked in. The paperwork for the amendment went in on a Monday. The county said 6 weeks. Then a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week, the store filled up. Not for suppers, for coffee, for eggs, for a small bag of onions, for the 20-cent packets of laundry detergent Val had suggested she put by the register because the laundromat's own vending machine had broken. The rain had started at noon and had not stopped, and every person in a 3-block radius had ducked in out of the rain and stayed for one more thing. Burn a mod coffee. Cassius sat at the little stool Cassius had somehow acquired for himself near the counter. Ambrose came in still in his delivery uniform and started bagging without being asked. At 2:40 in the afternoon, a customer came up to the register with a jar of preserves and asked whether the label said low sodium or regular. That was preserves, Millie told her. The woman knew. There was no sodium in preserves. There was sodium in everything. The customer insisted. She needed to know. Millie's head was pounding. She had eaten half a granola bar at 9 in the morning. Her hands felt cold. There was a small, tight line of pressure behind her breastbone that she had been feeling on and off for 3 days and had been ignoring the way she had been ignoring everything else. She turned toward the produce table. Berna, could she take this? Berna came around the produce table without a word. except, except the customer was talking to Millie, and Berna reached, and Millie flinched. Not on purpose, just a small twitch of her hand on the jar. Berna stopped, waited, held out her hand again. Millie had it. She had said she had it. Her voice came out sharp, sharper than she meant. She heard it come out of her own mouth and could not pull it back. Berna, it was fine, she said. She didn't need help right now. The word, the word landed in the store like a dropped can. Help! Cassius, at his stool, looked down at his coffee. Ambrose, at the door, went very still. Berna took a slow breath, nodded once. Then she took off her apron. She did not throw it. She did not slam it. She folded it in a slow, careful, deliberate square, the way she folded a dish towel at the end of a shift. She set it on the counter next to the register. Millie tried her name. Berna cut her off gently. She had spent 21 years in a plant cafeteria being called family by men who cut her pay. She had spent the last 2 years being called help by a contractor who took her benefits. She had told Millie at the auction. She had said what she was. I know. You said manager. You wrote it on a napkin. Berna. I'm not your help. The customer with the preserves was frozen in place. Berna picked up her canvas tote. Feed people, not egos. She walked past Millie without touching her. Not angry. Just done. That was the worst of it. She was not angry. She had made a decision. She walked out through the front door and into the rain. The bell over the door still didn't work. The silence after Berna left had a shape. Ambrose picked up a bag of onions, set it down, picked it up again. Cassius stood up from his stool. He didn't say anything either. He just stood up, because a man of a certain age stands up when a woman he respects walks out of a room in the rain. Millie rang up the customer's preserves. Her hands were shaking. The customer paid, told her, quietly, to take care of herself. Left. Millie stood behind the register. The pressure behind her breastbone tightened. She reached out, gripped the edge of the counter, and lowered herself onto the padded stool Cassius had, at some point, silently installed for her. Ambrose came around the counter. She was fine. She tried. She was not fine. He answered. Ambrose. Sit. I am sitting. Then breathe. She did. In. Out. Slow. In. Out. The pressure eased. Her hand stopped shaking. She looked up. Ambrose was crouched in front of her with one hand on the stool and one hand on his own knee. Cassius was on the phone. Who was he calling? Deirdre. Do not call Deirdre. He was not going to call her uncle. She wanted to laugh. She could not. She nodded. Cassius kept talking. Low. Into the phone. Ambrose stayed crouched. When had she eaten? This morning? What? A granola bar? Millie? She said she knew, which was a lie, because she did not know. She had not known anything for weeks. She had known only the shape of the day and the shape of the shelves and the shape of the growing balance in the loan account and the shape of the growing hole where her sleep used to be. She looked at the folded apron on the counter. Neat, square, deliberate. The neatness of it hurt more than a slammed door would have. Ambrose flipped the sign on the door to closed. Ambrose, half day. It was raining. People were coming in. Half day. He repeated. Cassius was still on the phone in the corner. Millie heard him say her name and then say her aunt's name and then say the word she's all right. She just took a wobble. She was not sure whether to be furious or grateful. She was mostly too tired for either. She closed her eyes. Somewhere on the sidewalk outside, in the rain, Berna was walking to her car with her canvas tote. She went upstairs at 8 that night. She heated a piece of leftover cornbread in the toaster oven. She sat at the kitchen table with the plate in front of her and did not eat it. She looked around the room. The blue chair by the window, the pantry door with the pencil marks, Grace's mark at 15, Corwin's mark at 14, higher than Grace's, though only by an inch. Deirdre's at 8, Millie's own mark, added when she was 17 and had refused to be measured until Grandpa had followed her around the apartment with a pencil until she gave in. The ceiling fan clicked. Once, twice. Millie stood up, Halfway to the sink, her knees went. She did not fall hard. She half sat, half dropped, onto the kitchen floor with one hand still on the edge of the counter. The linoleum was cold through her jeans. She sat there for a long moment, not panicking, not crying, just, just sitting. Because the thing behind her ribs had come back, and this time it did not tighten so much as spread. A dull, heavy warmth, like the way a bruise feels the day after. She looked up at the ceiling, at the water stains shaped like a bird, at the crack in the plaster near the fan Grandpa had never let her fix. She thought about her mother. The last conversation. Grace propped up in the hospital bed, the room too warm, the nurse's shoes squeaking down the hall. Grace, in a voice already going thin, telling her to listen. A woman without a room of her own eventually becomes a room in somebody else's house. She heard her. She always kept a door. Millie had thought at the time that her mother meant the yellow house. Now, on the kitchen floor of an apartment above a store that had almost swallowed her whole this afternoon, she understood. Grace had not meant walls. Grace had meant this: the pressure inside your chest when you have been carrying too many people, when you have made yourself so useful that no one can see you underneath. When the word help slips out of your mouth and takes down a woman who once told you, at an auction, that you did not have a store yet. Millie sat on the linoleum for 30 minutes. She got up. She drank a glass of water. Slowly. Standing at the sink. She looked out the window at the street lamp on the corner. The light buzzed. The pipe in the wall knocked twice. She went downstairs to the store, turned on one bank of lights. She wrote, on the front door in blue marker on a sheet of white paper. In her mother's slanted hand, closed Saturday, Monday, Tuesday, reopening Wednesday. Call for phone orders. Thank you. She taped it to the glass. She locked the door. She went back upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she picked up a pen and began to write out, in a numbered list, everything she was going to have to say to Bernadine Wexford before Saturday morning was over. Berna had been right about one thing, and Millie had been right about another, and Grace had been right about the door. Millie was going to walk to Berna's house in the morning. She was going to walk because she needed the 6 blocks to think. She was going to bring nothing, not preserves, not soup, not an apology dressed up as a gift. She was going to bring one piece of paper, and a title on that paper that was not going to include the word help. Ever. Again. Saturday morning came in gray. Millie put on her mother's brown cardigan for the first time in 4 years. Not for luck. For weight. Grace's cardigan was heavy across the shoulders. It made you stand a certain way. She walked. 6 blocks. Wet leaves on the sidewalk. A woman was watering her stoop with a coffee cup, which made no sense, but this town had never made sense. Millie passed the barbershop on the corner Corwin had almost sold, past the shoe shop where Owen Ostrom was raising the metal gate one hand crank at a time. Owen saw her, lifted his chin, did not wave, did not stop her. That was the second kindness of the week. Berna's house was a small brick duplex with yellow curtains. Potted herbs crowded the front porch. Rosemary, thyme, a basil plant that had been let to flower. Millie stood on the doormat with one folded piece of paper in her hand and rang the bell. Long wait. Long enough she started to leave. The door opened. Berna was in a house coat and slippers, hair uncombed. She looked at Millie without expression. She did not open the storm door. She had walked. Berna observed. Millie had walked. She looked like she slept in a car. Berna added. She had slept on her kitchen floor for part of it. Millie admitted. Berna's face didn't change, except it did. Just a small softening around the eyes. The kind of softening you had to have been watching for. Millie held up the paper. She had brought one thing. That was all. If Berna didn't want to read it, Millie would go home. She just needed to hand it to her. The storm door opened. Berna took the paper. She did not step aside. Millie stood on the doormat while Berna read. The paper had 4 lines. Bernadine Wexford, food manager, weekly food budget set by both of us. No changes made without your knowledge. Full title on the payroll. Full title on the door of the kitchen. Full title said out loud in front of every customer. After 3 profitable months, 10% of prepared food net. Berna read the paper twice. She lowered it, looked past Millie, at the wet leaves on the front walk, at the water dripping off the porch railing. Millie could not afford 10%. Millie could not afford to lose her. That was not the same math. I know it isn't. Berna folded the paper along its existing crease. She looked at Millie for a long moment. Her eyes were the same eyes she had used at the auction to read a compressor housing. Then she opened the storm door the rest of the way and stepped back. Come inside. Millie's knees almost went for the second time in 2 days. She grabbed the door frame. Berna saw it. Did not comment. Stepped aside further. Come inside. Sit. Berna was going to feed her something that was not a granola bar. How did she? Cassius. He had called her last night. That man could not keep a secret to save his kneecaps. Millie stepped into the small, warm kitchen. It smelled like coffee and dill. Berna pointed at a chair. Millie sat. Berna set a plate in front of her. Eggs. Toast. A small dish of preserves that Millie recognized as her own from the second week of opening. She looked at the preserves. Berna had bought them. At full price. Millie was not to get sentimental. Millie ate. She ate slowly at first, then faster. Then, on the third bite, tears just started running down her face without any warning at all. She didn't sob. She didn't cover her face. She just kept eating. The tears rolled down and dropped onto the plate and salted the eggs. Berna sat across the table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She let Millie cry. That was the third kindness of the week. Finally, for crying. Millie tried. For calling Berna help. I know. I don't get to just say it and be done. Berna set her mug down slowly. She got up, went to the counter, poured herself more coffee she didn't need, came back, sat down. All of that took 30 seconds. Millie waited. No. Berna answered when she was ready. Millie did not. She was going to have to say it every time her chest got tight, every time a customer talked over Berna, every time she forgot. I know I will. She was going to have to say it in front of the woman with the preserves. When she came back, she was not coming back. Millie whispered. Berna's mouth did the almost smile thing. She reached into the pocket of her housecoat and produced a folded scarf. The customer had left this on the community table. Cassius had kept it. He had been holding it hostage for 3 days. Millie almost laughed. She looked at the paper on the table between them. Berna picked it up, slid it across. Sign it. Berna first. That was not how contracts worked. That was how this one worked. Berna took the pen from the little jar next to the salt shaker. She signed her name, slid the paper back. Millie signed hers underneath. And for the first time in weeks, her handwriting looked like her mother's again instead of like a person holding a pen with a hand made of wood. Berna stood up, took the plate, refilled the coffee. Millie was going to eat lunch she announced, and Berna was going to see her eat it. Yes, ma'am. And Millie was going to sit on Cassius's stool once an hour whether she felt like it or not. Yes, ma'am. And Millie was going to stop starting at 4:30 in the morning. The shelves faced themselves eventually. That was a fact of physics. Millie laughed. Actually laughed. The full laugh she had not laughed since the day of the ham. Berna sipped her coffee and pretended not to be pleased. She was, however, pleased. Ambrose was harder. Millie found him Tuesday evening at the back of the distributor's warehouse. He was loading crates onto his truck with the practice motions of a man who had done this exact motion 480 times a month for 2 years. He saw her, kept loading. She had read his proposal. She told him. He had read it before. She had skimmed it and looked for reasons to say no. That was still reading. Ambrose. He set down a crate, turned, wiped his hands on his jeans. Millie, she was not offering him the kitchen because she felt guilty about last week. That would be worse. I know. She was offering it because Berna and she had looked at the numbers, and if they got the suppers back on the 16th, they could not make them in the little back area. They needed somebody with a real setup, and the rear section was empty, and she was tired of pretending it did not need to be a kitchen. Ambrose leaned against the truck. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she felt heat come up the back of her neck. She did not look away. She had looked at his numbers. She had looked at his numbers 3 times. He had underestimated his gas line. He had overestimated his first-year utilities. His rent number was too low. He was trying to raise his rent in her own store, only by $50 a month, which he should already be paying to sleep at night. He laughed once. Short, real, Millie, Ambrose. She had told him his last restaurant closed because he was bad at money. She had not said bad. She had said he had a partner in a disagreement. She had said failed. Twice she was sorry. It was not fair. No, it wasn't. I know. He was not signing a lease with somebody who thought he was one bad quarter away from taking her down. She didn't think that. She had last month. She had last month. She didn't now. He looked past her at the warehouse, at the pallets, at the small yellow forklift that had been idling in the corner all summer with a piece of duct tape holding the seat together. Berna had said yes. Berna had signed first. Of course she had. Ambrose, Millie told him, was to bring her a new proposal. Not the one she had seen. A new one, with numbers that would let him sleep. Bring it Wednesday. Before opening. She would read it slow this time. He nodded once, went back to loading crates. She turned to go. Millie. She stopped. Yes. Thank you. For what? For not offering him a favor. She walked back to the parking lot with the cold coming down through the collar of her coat and the sky the color of a swept sidewalk. And she understood, finally, what her mother had meant about a door. The store reopened on a Wednesday. Ambrose brought the new proposal at 6 in the morning. 3 pages. Millie read it slowly, signed it slowly. He shook her hand across the community table like they were two people who had just bought a car together. Berna tied her apron. Cassius arrived at 6:45 with a wooden stool he had built himself out of scrap from an old chair. He set it down beside the register. He did not explain it. He just set it down and told her it was for her feet. Sit on it whether she wanted to or not. Millie flipped the sign to open at 7. Hollis Prewitt was already on the sidewalk. Purple raincoat. You're late. I'm 1 minute early. By your clock. By everyone's clock. Well, Hollis had been there since 6:40 and her feet hurt. She marched in, went to the eggs, bought 2 cartons and a loaf of white bread, complained that the bread was still too thin, told Millie she was glad she was back, marched out. Nobody made a fuss about the reopening, which was exactly right. The suppers came back the second week. The soup came back the same day. The Friday rush came back on the 3rd Friday, harder than before, because Val at the laundromat had spent the whole intermission telling every customer who came in for quarters that Millie's had a health permit that was cleaner than most hospitals. She had made that up. She said it with such confidence that no one questioned it. Rosalind Fenster, next door, put a hand-lettered sign in her own window that just read, "We like Millie's next door." Millie stopped counting the small kindnesses after that. There were too many. The community table appeared on a Tuesday. Cassius had been muttering about it for a month. He had said more than once, and to nobody in particular, that a person could not drink coffee in a store unless there was somewhere to put the coffee down. Berna had said that a store was not a diner, at which point Cassius said back that a store where people had nowhere to put things down was a store where they didn't stay. And Berna, who considered herself the winner of most arguments by default, had gone quiet, which meant Cassius had won. Hyan Ambrose came in on a Tuesday morning at 5:30 with a slab of butcher block Ambrose had gotten cheap from the same restaurant auction where Berna had said don't. They cut it, sanded it, set it on 4 sturdy legs, placed it in the open space near the front window. By the end of the day, Hollis had sat at it, declared the chairs too low, and gone home. She came back the next morning with her own cushion. She left the cushion on her chair. That was the beginning of a claim. By the end of the month, 3 other regulars had left cushions. By the end of the second month, Val was playing gin rummy at the table on Wednesdays with a woman named Gloria, who had never been in the store before Millie opened it. The community table changed the shape of the room. More than the sign, more than the shelves, more than any of it. Because people who had never had somewhere to sit down together on this block now had somewhere to sit down together on this block. And a girl of 21 who had come to this apartment at 17 with a suitcase and her mother's sweaters was watching it happen from behind a register. And on some mornings, if the light hit the counter a certain way, she looked exactly like her mother. Deirdre came for a Friday. Millie didn't ask her to. Deirdre just showed up, without a folder this time, with a small overnight bag and a plate of lemon bars her book club had made for a bake sale and had 10 left over of. She stayed the weekend. She worked the register on Friday afternoon. She was, as it turned out, terrible at it. She scanned the same jar 4 times. She asked a customer whether cashback meant the store gave part of the price back. She weighed one onion 3 times because she could not remember whether it was per pound or each. Millie stood behind her the whole afternoon, not correcting, just present. At 6 p.m., when the last customer left, Deirdre turned to Millie with her lipstick smudged and her hair coming out of its clip. She was not going to bring Millie any more folders. She said quietly, "Deirdre." She meant it. She was not. She had looked at the numbers. She said she had looked at the rent in the inventory turn and what Millie was pulling on Fridays. She had looked. She knew what she didn't know. She didn't know this. She knew brochures. She knew spreadsheets. She knew what nursing school cost. She did not know how to build a place people wanted to come back to. Deirdre. She had brought Millie a folder in her grandfather's kitchen 4 days after he died. I remember. She had told herself it was because she loved her. I know you did. She had loved her, and she had also not been able to stand watching Millie make a life she had not planned for her. Millie's throat closed. She stepped forward. She hugged her aunt across the counter. She hugged her hard. She hugged her the way she had not been able to hug her at the funeral, because at the funeral she had been so tired she had almost forgotten how her own arms worked. Deirdre held on and did not sway her the way she used to sway her when Millie was a child. She just held on. Corwin came in for coffee on the 3rd Wednesday of November. He did not talk to her. He bought coffee. He paid. He sat at the community table for 11 minutes. He watched Cassius argue with Hollis about a crossword clue. He got up. He left. He did that on the 4th Wednesday, and on the 5th, and on the 1st Wednesday of December. He never brought his toolbox. Millie never asked him what he was doing. She knew what he was doing. He was learning the sound of the store his father had spent 5 decades building, without ever letting his son inside the counter. He was letting himself sit in it. He was letting himself be nobody in it. He was letting himself, at 59 years old, be a customer for the first time in his life. That was the thing about Corwin. He was never going to say he was sorry with his mouth. He was going to sit at a table once a week until it meant something. The land deal fell apart. Rosalind heard about it first, because Rosalind heard about everything first. She came into the store on a Monday morning in early December with her arms folded high across her chest and her mouth pursed in the exact shape it made when she was about to enjoy delivering bad news that wasn't hers. They had passed on the corner. Millie stopped mid-bag. The developers. They had gone for a bigger corner 4 towns over. Better highway access. The rumor mill said they had never really loved this block. They had loved the price her uncle was willing to talk them into. Millie did not say anything. Rosalind gave her one long look. Her uncle was in trouble. I know. She had known. She had known for months. And she hadn't sold. No. Rosalind's mouth twitched. Well, she bought her coffee. She left. Millie stood behind the register for a long moment. She looked at the community table, at Hollis's cushion, at the spot where Cassius had built the table with his own hands, at the wall behind the register where her grandfather's block letters were still visible on the paint underneath a slightly newer coat. Then she went into the storeroom. She opened the cabinet. She pulled out the notebook from the year Corwin turned 19. She flipped to the pages she had already marked with a torn piece of receipt tape. She found the entry. Cor, 600. April. To start the crew. No interest. Do not remind him. Underneath it, in different ink, added later. He forgot, which is all right. He was going to build something. That is what the money was for. Millie closed the notebook. She put it in her cardigan pocket. She walked out. Corwin came to the store that evening at 7:40. He didn't come in the front. He came around the back, knocked on the alley door, which was something he had not done since he was 22. Millie let him in. He was in his work coat, dust in the creases at the elbows. He looked older than he had a month ago. He looked like a man who had been counting weeks on the wrong side of his ledger. He sat down at the community table without asking. The store was closed. The lights were low. Berna had gone home. Cassius had gone home. Ambrose was in the back kitchen washing pans, and when he heard the alley door, he did not come out. He knew when a room was not his. Millie brought 2 cups of coffee, sat down opposite her uncle. Corwin held the mug in both hands. She had heard. I heard. He needed to ask her something. Corwin, Millie, please, just let him ask. She waited. He looked at the coffee. They had pulled out, which meant his only real asset left was the piece of the block he already had contracts on, which was nothing without the corner, which meant the whole thing was nothing, which meant Susan went back to work at 58 and they sold the house. Corwin, let him finish. She let him. I needed to ask her, officially, this one time, would she sell him back a piece of this building? A percentage, enough that he could carry it to a buyer as a package. He would give her above market. He would give her enough that she could finish the roof and refit the upstairs. He would structure it so she kept operational control of the store for 10 years, no matter who owned the brick. The coffee steamed between them. She looked at his hands. Big hands, rough, same knuckles as his father, same knuckles as her mother. Actually, she had never noticed that before. Grace had had those same square knuckles on smaller hands. Millie reached into her cardigan pocket. She took out the notebook. She set it on the table between them. Closed. She kept one hand on it. She wanted to show him something first. Corwin looked at the notebook. His face changed. Not because he recognized it. He did not recognize it. He had never seen it before. His face changed because his niece was sliding an old composition book across a community table at 8 p.m. on a Monday with the look of a woman who was about to hand him something he was not prepared to receive. What was it? Open it. Millie, open it. Corwin. He opened it. He flipped to the middle. Names, amounts, dates. He flipped back, kept flipping. His hand slowed. Then he saw his own name. He stopped. The room was very quiet. The compressor of the new cooler in the corner hummed the low hum it had settled into over the fall. Ambrose, in the back, ran water. Somewhere out on the street a car passed. Slow, its headlights sweeping the papered edges of the front windows. Corwin read the entry. He read it again. Cor, 600, April. To start the crew. No interest. Do not remind him. He turned the page. He read the note underneath. He forgot, which is all right. He was going to build something. That is what the money was for. He did not move. Millie watched him. She watched a man of 59 years old find out, on a Monday night in December, at a community table in a store he had tried to sell out from under his own family, that his father had loved him. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter and more uncomfortable. She felt sorry for him. She had spent 7 weeks angry at this man. 4 months before that suspicious of him. 4 years before that, half afraid of him. And in 90 seconds, a composition book had cut him open in a way none of her arguments ever could. She had not done that on purpose. She had done it on purpose. Both were true. She was going to have to live with both. She kept her hand on the far corner of the notebook, not to hold it down, to let him know she wasn't going to take it away. Corwin did not cry. I was not a man who cried. He put his elbow on the table and put his forehead in his hand and stayed that way for a long time. When he lifted his head, his eyes were red. He did not wipe them. He did not apologize for them. Millie, I know, he had told him at 19 he wasn't a man. He was a manual. I know he did. And then he gave him $600. He did. He did not tell him. He didn't tell anybody. That was who he was. Why hadn't she used this against him? She was not using it against him. She was showing it to him. Corwin looked at the notebook. He touched the entry with one finger, very carefully, the way a man touches something he is afraid will disappear. She was not going to sell him the building. No. She was not going to bail him out. No. She was going to make him sit here. She was going to make him sit here. He nodded once. That was worse. I know, that was much worse. I know, I'm sorry. He looked at her. For a long second he looked at her the way he had looked at her when she was 7 and had come running out of her mother's yellow house with a scraped knee. Then the second passed and he was 59 again. He did not deserve this notebook. That was not for him to decide. Millie. He had written it because he wanted him to know. Someday. He had not known when someday was. She was telling him now. That was all. Corwin closed the notebook. He slid it back across the table. Keep it. It's yours. Millie. Keep it. He knew it existed. That was enough. If he took it, he would read it every night for the rest of his life, and he would not sleep. She kept it. She put her hand over his hand, just for a second, just long enough that he would feel it. Then she pulled her hand back and picked up her cup of coffee, which was, by then, cold. He stood. At the alley door he stopped. Millie. Yes. There was going to be a moment, in about a month, where he was going to try to give her something back. It was not the same. It was not enough. But he was going to try. He needed her to let him. I will let you. She did not know what it was. She knew it would be too big for the wall it was meant for. He laughed. Once. Wet. Yeah, I will let you. Corwin. But it will hang inside. Not out. I figured. He left. She sat at the community table for a long time after he was gone. The steam from the second cup of coffee had stopped rising. The store was very still. Ambrose came out of the back with a dish towel over his shoulder. Did not ask. She told him, without looking up, to go home. She would lock up. He went home. The anniversary morning came bright and cold. Bunting on the awning. Deirdre had driven up. She and Val were tying blue and cream ribbons to the folding chairs on the sidewalk with the seriousness of two women who had never worked together on anything and had, in the last 4 hours, become inseparable. Berna was inside setting up sample cups. Ambrose was in the back kitchen slicing biscuits. Cassius was standing at the community table with his arms folded, watching the door. Millie was behind the register in her mother's brown cardigan. The store filled up for the announced start time. Hollis Prewitt was the first one in, on her own cushion, in her purple raincoat, complaining that the ribbons were the wrong shade of blue. At 10:40 in the morning, Corwin's truck pulled up to the curb. He got out alone. No crew this time. No ladder. He walked around to the tailgate and pulled back a canvas drop cloth. Under the drop cloth was the old Danvers General Store sign, restored, freshly restored. In fact, he had matched the paint to Ellis's original green. He had repaired a split through the last E without straightening it. He had rebuilt the back with new lumber and cleaned every gold letter by hand. Millie could see the care from 10 feet away. She could see how many nights he had spent on it. She could see the way a man who had been told at 19 that he was a manual had spent the last month building something. He stood by the tailgate with his hands in his pockets. He did not walk in. He waited for her to come out. Millie set down what she was holding. She walked out from behind the counter, past the community table, past Cassius. Cassius did not follow her. Berna stayed where she was. Ambrose, from the back, did not appear. He knew when a room was not his. She went outside. She stood at the tailgate. She looked at the sign. For a long moment she just looked at it. It was beautiful. He had done the work. It was the thing her grandfather had painted the summer she turned 6. It was Ellis's crooked apostrophe, the one he had painted himself after refusing to pay the signmaker's price. Still crooked in exactly the way she remembered. She looked up at her uncle. It was beautiful. Millie, it was really beautiful. Corwin, he had done all of this. He had done all of this. Where did he want it? I did not miss a beat. He had rehearsed this. She could tell he had rehearsed this. He had probably rehearsed it in the truck, out loud, on the way over, wherever she wanted it, inside, above the community table. If that was still what she wanted, it was, all right. Nobody clapped. Millie was not counting anymore. Anyway, Cassius came out, Ambrose came out. The two of them carried the sign in the front door together, sideways, careful of the frame. Corwin walked behind them with a small canvas tool bag slung over his shoulder. He did not direct. He just walked. Inside, the whole store had gone quiet. Millie pointed to the wall above the community table. Corwin looked at Cassius. Cassius looked at Ambrose. The three of them measured, marked, drilled the anchors, set the brackets. Corwin drove the last two screws in himself. The last screw went in with a small final twist. He set the drill down on the table. He stepped back. He looked up at the sign. Danvers General Store. Green background. Gold letters. Crooked apostrophe. Restored by the hands of the man his father had once told he was not a man. Millie stood beside him. Above them. On the wall. Behind them. Through the front window. The blue sign with her own name hanging over the awning. Grandpa on the inside. Millie on the outside. Both of them home. Corwin did not say anything. He put one hand on Millie's shoulder. Not heavy. Not for long. Just a hand on her shoulder for 1 second. The same 1 second hand that Millie had put on his hand 2 months ago at this same table. Then he took his hand back. He picked up his tool bag. He walked out through the front door. He got in his truck. He drove away. Hollis Pruitt broke the silence. Somebody give her a biscuit before she forgot why she came. Berna laughed. Cassius laughed. Ambrose came around with a tray. Val hollered from the sidewalk about the ribbons being the right shade after all. Deirdre started to cry into her paper cup of punch and then started to laugh at herself for crying. And Rosalind next door walked in with a wrapped gift that turned out to be a set of laundromat coasters. The party started. Millie stood in the middle of it for a moment with her mother's cardigan across her shoulders and her grandfather's crooked apostrophe over her head. She thought about Grace. About Grace saying you always keep a door. About the door Corwin had come in through the back way on a Monday in December. About the door Berna had walked out of in the rain and then, weeks later, opened to her again at 8 in the morning in a housecoat. About the door Ambrose had leaned in at the delivery bay and said thank you for not offering him a favor. About Hollis's door, Val's door, Rosalind's door, Cassius's door, Owen Ostrom's door across the street, Deirdre's door in South Carolina, which had turned out to be closer than Millie thought. Grace had said, keep a door. Grace had not mentioned that if you kept your door, other people would come and stand in theirs and look across at you. The doors added up, made a street. The street added up, made a life. The winter was hard. The furnace on the second floor gave up at midnight in January, and Corwin drove over in a sleet storm and sat on the basement floor with a flashlight in his teeth while a repairman replaced a part. Deirdre called every Sunday. Millie answered every Sunday. In March, Berna's profit share cleared. She examined the check with a flat expression, folded it into her apron pocket, and said quietly, 2 hours later, that she had not paid for a grandchild's shoes in 5 years. Ambrose reduced his delivery routes in April. He kept 2. The rest of the week he cooked. Second shift kitchen. He painted the letters himself on the back door. Corwin held on, not because Millie bailed him out, because Millie sent him 3 flooring jobs from the community table, and he had asked her to say his name at the register the way she would say any other contractors. Corwin Danvers, not Uncle. He came in for coffee on Wednesdays. He argued crosswords with Hollis. He drove Millie's upstairs floor materials from the yard in his own truck. No delivery charge, which was, they both understood, not a favor. It was a Wednesday. That was all. On the last night of the first year, Millie closed the store at 8. She flipped the sign to closed. She wiped down the community table. She checked the drawer. She counted. Twice she locked the register. She walked to the front door and stood there with her hand on the knob and looked back at the store. The compressor hummed. The ceiling fan, which she had, at long last, replaced in October, did not click. Above the community table, in the low yellow light, her grandfather's crooked apostrophe leaned toward the door. Above the door itself, in the dark glass of the front window, her own name floated in cream against deep blue, backward from where she stood. She had not fallen again in 6 months. She was eating lunch every day. She was sitting on Cassius's stool once an hour, whether she felt like it or not. The loan was not paid off. The roof would need to be fully replaced next year. She was 21 years old. She was 21 years old, and she owned a door. She stepped outside. The cold caught her in the chest. She locked the front door with the same set of keys her grandfather had used for 51 years. Then she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the sign. Millie's Market. The wind moved a torn ribbon still tied to the awning from the anniversary. It brushed the top of the sign the way a hand might. Then it settled. Across the street, the light in the shoe shop went out. Owen Ostrom raised his hand from the doorway. She raised hers back. Then she went around to the alley, unlocked the door to the stairs, and went up. Because she lived there, because she had chosen the rooms, because she had chosen the loan and the aching days below them. Because a woman without a room of her own eventually becomes a room in somebody else's house. Because Grace had said, keep a door. Because Ellis had left 40 years of quiet in a wooden cabinet. Because Corwin had come around the back way in December. Because Berna had opened the storm door. Because Hollis Prewitt would come tomorrow morning at 6:40 and complain about the bread. Millie climbed the stairs to the second floor. She skipped the third step. She always would.